Hello and welcome to February's TBR Spin choice and also the review for the January pick book. However, this is going to be a bit of a bumper one, so not only am I going to review this one, but I'm also going to review this because someone commented, J Pink Pop, I don't know who that is, commented to say that they'd read this and really liked it but hadn't heard anyone talk about it, and that was all I needed. That was all I needed to decide that I should move on and read this as well and give it a chance, because I haven't heard anyone talk about it. So you're going to get both reviews at the end of this. The February pick on the prompt, choosing the book with the lowest reviews either on Goodreads or Storygraph. So I use Storygraph, which does mean you have to go through and look at them individually. So this is the one that we're going to be doing. This is Ross King, Ex-Libris. This had an average rating of something like 3.08, which is very low. Like, most books will sit between a 3.5 and a 4, unless they're like really well loved books, in which case they'll be over a 4. But yeah, so 3.08 is actually incredibly low. I didn't look at any of the reviews, so I don't know what people are saying. Yeah, so the other ones that I was wondering, Goliath had like 3.58. Reprieve was something like 3.52. Two Wrongs was like a 3.4 something. So we were getting quite low. But yeah, it's going to be this one. This is the historical thriller. So we've got a cryptic summons to a remote country house launches a London bookseller on an odyssey through 17th century Europe, given the task of restoring a magnificent library that has been pillaged during the English Civil War. Isaac Inchbold finds himself slipping from the surface of 1660s London into an underworld of spies and smugglers, ciphers and forgeries. As the bookish Inchbold assembles the fragments of a complex historical mystery, he learns how Sir Ambrose Plessington, founder of the library, escaped from Bohemia on the eve of the 30 Years' War with plunder from the Imperial Library. Inchbold's hunt for one of those stolen volumes, a lost hermetic text, soon casts him into an elaborate intrigue involving such seemingly unrelated events as the sack of Constantinople in 1453 and Sir Walter Raleigh's last voyage in search of the gold of El Dorado. Set in an age of scientific advancement and religious persecution, Ex-Libris sweeps back and forth between Prague and London, between explorations in astronomy and recipes for invisible ink, between artistic achievement and political upheaval. Ultimately, Inchbold's fortunes hang on the discovery of the missing manuscript, but his search reveals that the lost volume is not what it seems and that he has been made an unwitting player in a treacherous game. So I don't know if I mentioned this when I was going through them all, but Ross King is an author that I came across because of his non-fiction. I've got a couple of his pieces that are about the Renaissance period. One's called Brunelleschi's Dome. So yeah, hopefully someone who is an academic in that period should be able to write an interesting fictional piece about that era, but the review suggests maybe not, so we'll see. Okay, so on to my review about Ali Smith. Now, this caused so much controversy. I knew when I picked it that, say, Kieran from KD Books hates this and thinks it's trash. And when I mentioned that it was, people like Jill from the Book Bully said she really didn't like it, thought it didn't do anything. But then the premise of it just sounded so interesting, you know, this idea of philosophy and art and interweaving stories. Like, there are all sorts of things that I love. So I was really, like, I went into this with a completely open mind. Even though people hate it, I thought, you know what, it doesn't matter. I'll see whether I like it. Often when people hate stuff, I end up loving it. So this has been nominated and has won countless awards. I suppose because it's so experimental. Like, it's a clear one to go on things like the Goldsmiths Awards, Booker Awards. I'm kind of surprised that it was nominated for the Women's Prize, because it does seem a lot more complex than most of the books that end up being in the Women's Prize. But anyway, I did a little research on it before I started and worked out that because this is two stories, that whilst they interweave and relate to each other, they don't have to be read in any specific order. So half of the publication half of the books published started with George's story, George being a teenage girl questioning her sexuality, and the other half were published with Francesco's story first, Francesco being a painter in, when even was it? In the 1400s, who is playing a man in order to be considered for the painting, to do this famous painting. So my version starts with George's story first, which I've seen people refer to as the easy way in, because George's story is somewhat more coherent. It's slightly less poetic. So the first couple of pages are very dense, and I did find it difficult to get into, but I never DNF before 30% in a book. I always like to give something a chance to get going. You know, being difficult to get into is not a reason not to continue with a book. But so I am glad, because I ended up really enjoying that first half. It is difficult because it's pretty stream of consciousness, but relating to the grief over the mother's death. So it's a very specific event, and so she's questioning before and after, like, what tense should I use when I talk about my mum? Should I be using the present tense or the past tense? And I can't imagine a future. So it's both stream of consciousness, but also this questioning over what's past and what's present when you're looking at, you know, when she falls into a memory, should she be using past tense or present tense? And I did find that, whilst difficult to get into, I found it actually really good. I really quite enjoyed that. And I was beginning to think that I really didn't agree with everyone else's opinions that this was so bad. I thought, actually, I quite enjoy this. I think this is quite clever. However, the ending of that particular story felt a little flat to me. Like, I was hoping that in the next part it would start to build again. Obviously, you can read these separately. They don't have to read them together. But part of me was like, oh, I hope there's going to be a bit more about George in the next one, because the ending just felt very, I don't know. I know you can read it in different ways. I was just like, meh, I don't really know. So I started the next half, and this is a lot more complex. And I think I DNF'd. Essentially, I DNF'd. 60% in, I DNF'd. So you switch stories about a halfway point. I gave it a little bit, but I really couldn't be bothered with the overly complex writing in Francesco's story. I skipped ahead a bit because I thought I knew that in George's story I found the first few pages a bit difficult, and I thought, and then it like eased up and it became more easy to understand, and I wondered whether Francesco's story might feel the same, like really difficult to get into, but then eased up in the language as it got into the flow. But no, it just continued in that very peculiar way. So I just couldn't be bothered. I just really didn't want to read it, so I didn't. However, I am aware that there are books that I now enjoy that I didn't enjoy, say, a few years ago. So I am going to keep this on my shelf, because I wonder whether I'll want to come back to it in the future and try again. I just have a hunch that that's going to happen. Like, I would describe this as being for experienced readers. So most of the people talking about books on YouTube read a lot of books and would probably class themselves as experienced readers. But when I'm talking about experienced readers, I'm talking about people who like a complex book, and who, I mean, not necessarily have been to university and studied literature, but it's likely that they have learned about literature, whether through a formal educational setting, or whether they just read a lot about books and about literature. I think this is a book that's for people who want a challenge and who enjoy that sort of a challenge. I think I'm getting there. This is why I say I think this is something I want to keep on my shelf, because whilst I didn't enjoy this now, I did enjoy last year Mrs. Dalloway, which I think a few years ago I would have really disliked. And for instance, this month I'm about to do a reread of Far From the Madding Crowd, which is a book that I read when I was doing my GCSEs way back when, and I hated it because I hated the poetic language. But now when I see people talk about Far From the Madding Crowd, it sounds like all the sorts of things that I love now. So yeah, this is not for me now. Maybe it will be for me in the future, but the thing I kept thinking as I was reading it was that its complexity is getting in the way of a good time, but maybe my idea of a good time might change over the years. So yeah, this is not the sort of book that you should read if you like, say, supermarket fiction, or if you just like, say, general women's prize fiction. Like, I don't think this is for the average reader. I think this is for people who are advanced readers. There you go. DNF'd, didn't like it, but can see why people like it. But yeah, so when I saw that somebody had commented on that video that they had read this and hadn't heard anyone talking about it, but they really enjoyed it, I then thought, right, that's all I need. It's not very long. I think it's 276 pages. It's described as being like a Sally Rooney. I can understand why people say that, because it is set in Ireland and it's talking about people growing up in rural villages wanting to move into, say, Dublin and wanting to get away from the rural life. And it also has questions about class divides, so this idea that there are some wealthy families for whom some of the issues of rural life aren't as enormous as for those who are really struggling to get by. But then equally, I've seen a lot of people who said they picked it up because it was described as being for fans of Sally Rooney. And then we're like, well, it's not like Sally Rooney. It's not like normal people. What are you talking about? And I can understand that perspective as well, because this is not a romance. This is not about a couple. I know Sally Rooney, I know that Normal People is not exactly a romance because it's such a toxic relationship, but it is about a romantic relationship between two people. This is about friends. Very specifically, we focus on, we're being told the story from one girl's perspective, Katie, who is one of the poorer people in the village, who is friends with a girl called Evelyn, who comes from a wealthier family. They are the wealthy family in the village. And then her cousin, who is also from a poor family. So it's the three girls, but then also encompasses some of the other boys and girls in their village. So it's about those relationships and how when you're trying to, say, get out of the rural village and you're trying to get to the city, go to college, trying to change your life, how those ties, those friendships, family or whatever it is back in the rural village, pulling you back in, how it's so hard to escape that. It's very dark. That those relationships are so toxic. It's about competition between friends. It's about how cruel children can be and how cruel those relationships can be, and about how you feel like you have to prove yourself to those people from back home. Like, I want the people that I grew up with to think, oh, hasn't she done well for herself? And just, yeah, it's like the competitiveness and the dark side of all of that stuff. The expectations on you that you feel from your friends and things. So all of this sort of narrative is told, so we're aging through the book. We start, I'd say the first third of the book is Katie and her friends growing up from about age 10 to about age 17. But you're not expressly told at the beginning of each chapter how old they are, and it's sort of through clues in the text. There'll come a mention of their age or time passing within the text to help you understand that it's moving. So at first I was a bit confused about what was going on because there was no obvious time jump from one chapter to another. Like, you might have two chapters of them age 10 and then suddenly they're age 12 or something. But once you figure out that we're gradually moving through, you then just start naturally looking for the clues. And I could see that perhaps people getting a bit irritated with if they're not used to that sort of storytelling. And then it changes to Katie being in Dublin and how she's basically the only one that's actually sort of gotten out, but she's still feeling those pulls back to the rural village. All of the narrative is also woven in with a bit of a mystery. So a girl comes to the village. She's kind of shunned because she's the new girl and how mean the kids are to her just because she's new, she's pretty, she does her own thing. But she disappears, and this disappearance of this girl and the mystery of that is woven throughout the whole narrative. So every now and then you'll come back to it. So you'll perhaps move on from it, carry on with your normal life, and then suddenly something happens and that story is back in it. I devoured this book in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. I needed to keep going. Because of the crime that's in it, there are clues that pop up throughout the text. Now, I never felt necessarily surprised by what was coming. Everything that did happen felt like it had some foreshadowing that came from it, that came before it. However, there were some red herrings. There were some things that happened where I was like, oh, does that mean this is going to happen? And then that wouldn't happen. But I wouldn't say I was ever surprised by the twists because they were always foreshadowed by something, but still so thoroughly enjoyable. Like, you're not going to get a shock out of this, but yeah, really enjoyable. And I do think it's for people who enjoyed Sally Rooney's works, in that it's about those class divides in Ireland and it's about toxic relationships. It's not about romantic relationships. There are some romantic relationships in it, but that's not the focus. It is about the friendships. So a really good book, and I'm really glad I decided to go for it after DNFing the Ali Smith. So there we go. And so those are my January reads, and that's going to be my February read. Thanks.